welcome to the second part of the personality assessment mini lecture. So in part one of the mini lecture, we examined the different types of data that are generated by personality tests, and I introduced you to objective personality tests as a contrast to the projective measures described. Remember, objective measures are those tests that require a person to rate themselves on a set criteria, and these typically take the form of a self-report measure. In this part two of the mini lecture on assessment, we'll look at objective tests a little more closely, with a particular focus on how these tests are constructed, and we'll also finish up with a few points about ethical issues that are related to the field of personality assessment. Okay, so remember that some of the criticisms of projective tests were related to ideas around reliability and validity. You'll recall that a reliable test will be one that gives close to the same answer, really, with every administration of the test. And validity of a test depends on its actual content. So selecting and writing the most suitable questions to measure a personality construct becomes a really crucial aspect of creating a valid and reliable objective test. And there are three main ways of constructing an objective test, and we'll look at them each individually now. So the first method is the rational method. This is where the questions asked seem to be logically and rationally reflective of what you're actually interested in measuring. We'll look at an example of a rationally constructed test in a minute. But I want to go on to briefly describe the next method, which is the factor analytic method. This is where you use a statistical technique to identify groups of personality descriptors from a large pool of terms that cluster together then to form factors. Again, we'll look at an example of a test constructed using this method in a minute. And then the third method that we're interested in today is the empirical method. This is quite a different method that sometimes doesn't have much face validity because the content of the question sometimes doesn't even matter. It sounds a bit weird, but you'll get it when we look at an example of this type of test construction later. But first, let's go back to the first method that I mentioned, and that's the rational method. So remember, the rational method basically means that you use test items where there is a rational or logical connection between the construct you're trying to measure and the actual questions. So there's typically a lot of face validity. It's clear what the question is asking about. It's sort of direct and undisguised, if you like. So if you take a look at these 5 questions from the Rosenberg self-esteem scale, you'll see what I mean. This scale is a 10-item scale that assesses global self-worth by measuring both positive and negative feelings about the self. The scale is believed to be unidimensional, so it's only interested in measuring self-esteem as a single construct. There are no subscales tapping into different aspects of how you view yourself. The questions are all thought to measure the one thing, self-esteem. If you looked at these questions without knowing what the name of the test was, I guess you would probably be able to come up with the construct that the scale is actually measuring. You'd guess that the questions are trying to tap into how you feel about yourself. There's sort of an obvious rational connection between the individual items and the overall construct that you're wanting to measure. So that's the rational method of constructing an objective test. The next method that I want to talk about is the factor analytic method. So this is a method that uses a statistical technique called factor analysis. Basically, this method allows you to identify which items or which personality descriptors group together to form a specific personality factor. So what you would do to start with in this method is you would generate a large pool of objective items. This might be terms that describe certain aspects of personality. Then you would convert these items into personality-related sentences. So I'm going to give you an example of this now. The questions on this slide are from a career vocational interest scale called the Holland scale. It asks the respondent to indicate how much they would enjoy undertaking each of the tasks on this list. And this is just a small sample of the items that make up the whole scale. If you read through each of the items, you'll see that they are most likely tapping different types of interests. So using factor analysis, this interest scale would be administered to a large pool of people, and the resulting data would be analysed to see which individual items group together to form a particular type of vocational interest or factor. The analysis is based on correlation. So, for example, people who indicated they would like to perhaps conduct a choir might also indicate that they'd like to direct a play. This would result in a positive correlation in the answers between these two items. There may be other individual items that reflect an interest in these types of artistic activities, and they would typically be all responded to favourably by the same people. All of these items would then have positive correlations and would therefore group together under a factor, and you might call that factor artistic, representing artistic interests or people who have an interest in artistic pursuits. These same people who have this particular artistic bent, if you like, may indicate that they would not like to study something like animal behaviour. So this item then becomes part of another group, perhaps with the item on the study of the structure of the human body and other similar items to this. This factor would then become something like an investigative factor. So all of the interests that fall under the notion that you're investigating something would correlate, and they would form like a subscale that represented investigative interests. So each item should load onto a specific factor. If it doesn't correlate consistently with similar items, a particular item might be dumped from the test if it's not a good performer, if you like. This is the technique that has been used to develop some of our most well-known personality measures, which have produced hundreds of personality descriptors or traits down to a small number of essential traits. So think about the Big Five, for example, or Cattell's 16PF. So if we go back to the steps for using the factor analytic method, we've generated our long list of objective terms. Now we administer these items to a large pool of people. We use our statistical analysis to help us decide how many factors and which items load on what factor. So we're looking at answers to questions that correlate with each other, and we can identify these through factor analysis. So then the next step is to consider what the items that group together have in common and to actually name the factor. So in the case of the Holland's interest scale that we just looked at, we had items that represented investigative interests and artistic interests, so those factors were named after those types of interests. There are some limitations associated with the factor analytic method. Firstly, the quality of the information from factor analysis is really limited by the quality of the items themselves. So in the case of Holland's vocational interest scale that you can see here, the items are grouped under 6 factors in all. So you've seen the artistic and the investigative factors. There's also a realistic factor, a conventional factor, an enterprising factor, and a social factor. So this is thought to represent the different types of interests that people might have in different vocations. But what if there's a type of interest that's not represented in any of the questions? What if new occupations emerge that involve skills or interests not listed in this scale? An important factor then might be left out. Another limitation is that the items are grouped using statistical analysis, but the researcher then needs to decide how the items are conceptually related. This means that there's necessarily some degree of subjectivity involved. So the artistic factor in the Holland scale that we can see here might just as easily have been labelled creative or imaginative, both of which might be slightly different conceptually to artistic. This degree of subjectivity calls into question the so-called objective nature of these tests. A final limitation of this type of method is that factors don't always make sense. So sometimes items correlate, but there's no clear conceptual reason why they do. Gordon Allport reported this phenomena in the 1950s, where he identified a personality factor that was made up of a combination of items that seemed a bit odd. So these items reflected loneliness, impulsiveness, guilt, nervousness, ease of emotional expression. So these are sort of very different personality descriptors, but they were all highly correlated. And to all put, there was no clear theoretical reason why these items might be connected. So sometimes factor analysis can throw up confusing sort of phenomena or confusing associations that is difficult to group together to come up with a solid factor. The third and final method of objective personality test construction that we will look at is the empirical method. With this method, the task is to identify items based on how people in pre-identified groups respond. The basic assumption here is that certain kinds of people have distinctive ways of answering certain questions. So the steps for using this method are as follows. So like in factor analysis, the first step is to gather a large pool of personality descriptors. The second step, however, is a little different because now you administer the items to people you've already divided into groups that you're interested in. So often this would be diagnostic categories or occupational groups. So for example, you might administer the test to a group of people who've been diagnosed with a particular disorder, so depression or anxiety, for example, and you'd administer the same test to a group of people who are free from depression or anxiety symptoms. Similarly, you might administer the test to a group of people who work in scientific occupations and to a group of people who don't. So you've got these groups already set up and you're interested in finding out where the differences are. So how people in certain groups that you've already decided upon respond to particular items. The aim is to see if there are particular ways that people who belong to a certain group might answer specific questions. So once you've administered the test to these groups, you would compare the answers across groups. If people with depression answer particular items differently to people without depression, then these questions might form a depression subscale. You would then expect that new people who complete the scale and answer the depression questions in the same way as the depression group would likely have depression. You would then cross-validate your findings, so that is, you determine whether the test can predict behaviour, diagnosis, or category membership each time you administer the test to a new sample. So the basic assumption here really is that certain kinds of people have distinctive ways of answering certain questions. The intriguing thing about this method is that it is atheoretical. The items are not constructed with the aim of ensuring either content validity or high face validity. In fact, proponents of this method would argue that it's not even necessary to know what the items ask. Sounds a bit weird, but let's have a look at an example. These are items from the MMPI. It's a commonly used personality test, and it's constructed using the empirical method. So have a quick look at the items here. And you'll see from reading the items that there's quite low face validity. It's really hard to know what personality construct each item might be tapping into. What could warm hands and feet possibly reflect in terms of a personality trait? So items can seem contrary or absurd, but certain groups of people seem to answer specific questions in the same way. For example, oddly, people with dermatitis typically answer true to the question, my daily life is full of things to keep me interested. So conceptually, it can be difficult to explain the connections. The good thing about this type of test, however, is that responses are really difficult to fake. It's hard to know which way to answer in order to present yourself in a positive light, as you may be able to do in tests that have high face validity. This type of test may in fact be a better way to measure traits that are high in social desirability or where there might be an advantage in faking good. Take empathy, for example. Using a rational self-report measure might mean that it's possible to inflate your score because it's clear how to answer the items to receive a high score. Using an empirically constructed measure of empathy might make it more difficult to fake. On the MMPI, for example, a preference for showers over baths correlated with empathy. Most people would not know how to answer a question on whether they prefer baths or showers in order to doctor their empathy score. Okay, so we've looked at how objective measures of personality are constructed. Such measures are used widely across different fields, including personnel recruitment, career counselling, and also in clinical practice. And personality assessment is big business. But there are some ethical issues associated with using personality assessments, and we'll finish this mini lecture by briefly addressing some of the most important considerations. Ethical issues in personality assessment are similar to those that apply to other psychological research in general. Some of the common concerns are things like obtaining informed consent, so the participant who's taking your test knows what they're signing up for, avoiding harm, so there are no unreasonable risks involved in participating in a testing procedure, protecting the rights of participants, so that is things like confidentiality and privacy of results, making sure that practice is based in scientifically obtained knowledge, so this is about using valid and reliable tests, and respecting the rights of the individual with whom the psychologist or the assessor or the tester is working. For example, ensuring that the testing process or the results of that process do not result in any sort of discrimination or stigmatisation. So they're basic ethical issues that apply to lots of areas of psychological research. There are some specific ones related to personality assessment, and we'll talk about those just briefly now. So a lot of the issues are related to how the tests are actually used. So whether it's used to learn about people in general, so researchers would typically use tests in this way, or whether it's around helping people. So for example, schools and careers counsellors use vocational interest tests, which can help identify potential career paths for individuals uncertain of which direction that they want to take. A potential problem with these types of tests, however, is that because these interest inventories are constructed using people already in a particular field, there's an underlying assumption that that particular field should continue to be populated by the very same people who took the test and provided the sort of normative data for the test. The danger here is that the field may not evolve and that it may continue to exclude certain types of people who've typically been underrepresented in that field before, whether it's women or minorities. Another type of personality test that's used particularly by employers for personnel selection is an integrity test. This type of test typically measures traits aligned with conscientiousness, which has been shown to predict pretty good job performance across many fields. These tests sometimes ask questions about past dishonest behaviours. So, for example, have you ever made a personal phone call at work? Honest people might face the dilemma of being honest and saying, yes, I have made a personal phone call at work, and thereby achieving a lower integrity score, versus lying in order to achieve a higher integrity score, which is ironic. Dishonest people, on the other hand, wouldn't necessarily face the same dilemma, as they might be more comfortable simply being dishonest or denying everything. Other criticisms of personality tests are that they are mechanisms for controlling people. So those people who fit the model of what an ideal employee in a particular field looks like are rewarded by being given the job, and those that don't are punished by either not being retained or not getting the job in the first place. Another general criticism is that the traits we measure are really meaningless until we actually measure them. So in a way, they're constructed entities that are only useful in particular situations. This notion leads to the argument that people should not be reduced to a set of scores, that it's degrading to do this for the person involved. Related to this is the question of what happens to our set of scores or our results after testing. Who gets access to them? And how is this information used? Are they confidential? According to APA ethics codes, in most types of testing, it's a requirement that anyone who's tested should receive feedback. However, one exception is in the case of testing done for the purpose of personnel selection. So people are not necessarily required to receive any feedback or results from these tests. The other thing is that personality tests and their results can be associated with stigma and discrimination. For example, in some countries, like the US, being diagnosed with a personality disorder can result in exclusion from therapeutic interventions in prison. And what if the results of a personality test were used to screen out potential employees based on whether or not they held pro-union beliefs or had particular spiritual beliefs? So these are some of the criticisms of personality assessment that touch on ethical issues. There are, of course, those who argue for the use of personality tests, and for the most part, they would say that the criticisms of tests are overstated, that traits are not constructed or invented, that they are discovered, and their nature and correlates have some grounding in science, that they're established empirically, that valid and reliable tests are extremely useful. For example, clinicians use tests often to help with diagnosis and treatment selection. And although some critics say that they only test what a person thinks or feels, that what someone does is more important in regard to functioning in a job, that an audition would be much more useful and a better indicator of job performance. Those in favour of personality tests for recruitment believe that these tests have merit in elucidating characteristics suited to a particular job, and they're certainly better than interviews, which are also common practice, but just as open to responding in a socially desirable fashion. So these are a few of the arguments for and against personality assessment. If you've undergone an assessment yourself, you might have some thoughts of your own on how effective and useful they are. So that brings us to the end of part 2 of the personality assessment mini lecture, where we talked about the 3 main methods of construct objective tests: the rational method, the factor analytic method, and the empirical method. We also finished up by touching on some of the ethical issues that surround personality assessment. So that's it for this week. Thanks for listening, everyone.